Ever feel like your brain has like two totally different modes? One minute you're on autopilot and the next you're practically breaking a sweat from, like just thinking.
Totally.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Get ready to see your own decision making in a whole new light.
You know, what Kahneman does so well is he gives us this model of our minds as having two systems for thinking. He calls them System 1 and System 2.
Okay, so not literally two separate brains in there duking it out, but thinking about it this way helps make sense of why we're sometimes brilliant decision makers and other times, well,
Yeah.
not so much. So walk us through these two systems. What are their defining features?
So picture System 1 as this constant hum of activity happening in the background. It's automatic, crazy fast, and it's mainly driven by emotions and instinct. Like
Okay.
when you see a familiar face in a crowd and instantly know who it is, or, if you hear a car screech nearby and you instantly react, that's all System 1.
So basically, our brains are on autopilot a good chunk of the day, which, I mean, makes sense.
Right.
We'd be totally fried if we had to overthink every little thing.
Exactly. System 1 is all about keeping things running smoothly without us even having to think about it.
Hmm.
But then we've got System 2. This is the slower, more analytical side.
Okay.
And let's be honest, kind of lazy side.
Yeah, I relate to that.
It's the mental muscle we have to consciously engage when we need to think things through carefully. Like, say, if you're solving a tricky math problem, learning a new language, or trying to resist that extra slice of cake.
It takes effort. And just like any muscle, System 2 gets tired.
Yes.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because Kahneman and his colleagues actually studied this by looking at people's pupils while they were doing these mentally demanding tasks.
I know, right? It's wild. They found that they could actually see how much mental effort someone was using just by looking at their eyes. Like as the problems got harder, their pupils would get wider.
Wow.
They even joked about having a window to the soul.
That's both amazing and a little creepy.
I know.
But it really highlights just how much effort goes into those moments when we're really engaging System 2.
For sure.
And it makes you wonder how often we're cruising on autopilot without even realizing it. So we've got System 2 doing the heavy lifting, but it sounds like it clocks out pretty early in the day.
Right, exactly.
And that's where those mental shortcuts, the heuristics, come into play.
Yes, those time-saving mental maneuvers of System 1.
Okay.
They can be incredibly useful, for navigating this complex world.
Right.
But, and this is key, they can also lead us down these surprisingly predictable paths of totally irrational thinking.
And that's what makes all this so interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're getting a sneak peek behind the curtain of our own minds.
Exactly. It's like getting the user manual for your own brain. So let's talk about a couple of these heuristics.
Okay.
One of the big ones is called the availability heuristic.
Hmm.
This one comes down to how our brains tend to judge things as being more frequent, more likely if they're easier to recall.
Okay, so like things that pop into our minds easily, we assume they happen more often.
Yes.
Like if I just saw a news report about a house fire, I might suddenly feel like house fires are like way more common than they actually are.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And often the things that are easiest for us to recall are those that are really vivid, really dramatic, or that we just saw or heard about recently. Think about the news, for example.
Yeah.
News thrives on the unusual, the scary stuff. You're way more likely to see a big headline about a shark attack than about someone who went swimming and, everything was totally fine.
That's so true. You never see those boring, everyday headlines. It really makes you think about how much our perception of risk is like totally skewed just by the types of stories we're exposed to.
It's a huge influence. And then there's another heuristic we should talk about. It's the representativeness heuristic. This one has to do with how we judge probabilities based on how well something matches our existing stereotypes or beliefs.
So instead of looking at like the actual odds, the statistics of something happening, our brains gravitate toward what just feels right based on our preconceived notions.
Yes, exactly. And to illustrate this, Kahneman talks about this fascinating study, the Tom W. problem.
Okay.
So in this experiment, they gave participants this short personality sketch of this made-up grad student, Tom W. They described him as like super analytical, not very creative, someone who really likes order and structure. Then they asked these people to rank the probability of Tom W. being enrolled in different graduate programs like computer science, engineering, or, social work.
So based on those traits, I'm guessing most people would assume he's more likely to be in a STEM field, right?
Exactly. And that's exactly what they found.
Yeah.
People overwhelmingly thought Tom W. was most likely in computer science or engineering,
Even though.
even though statistically, Those fields had far fewer students than, say, the humanities.
So even when the numbers, the actual facts, tell a different story,
Yeah.
our brains kind of want to stick with what fits the stereotype.
Exactly. And this tendency to overlook those base rates, that's a big theme in Kahneman's work.
Yeah.
It shows how often our intuition, while valuable in many ways, can lead us to make some pretty flawed judgments.
Okay, so we've got system one, our quick, heuristic-loving brain, and system two, our more analytical, but let's be honest, lazier brain.
Right.
But Kahneman takes it even further with this idea of WISIAD. What you see is all there is. What is that all about?
It's a really powerful concept.
Okay.
WISID speaks to this deep need our brains have for coherence, for a complete and tidy picture. We hate uncertainty so much that we often jump to conclusions based on whatever limited information happens to be right in front of us, and we don't even stop to think about what we might be missing.
So it's like that saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But here, it's like when all you see is this tiny sliver of information, you act like it's the whole story.
A perfect analogy.
Mhm.
And that tendency to form strong judgments based on incomplete information, it can really distort how we see situations and people.
So how do we fight back against this WISIAD effect? Like, do we need to be constantly second-guessing ourselves?
It's not about being skeptical of everything, but about realizing this tendency is always there.
Okay.
One helpful approach is to actively look for other viewpoints, to actively try to find what might be missing from our understanding.
So before forming, like, a firm opinion,
Yeah.
we should ask, okay, what information might I be missing here?
Exactly.
Wow, this is really making me think. So these heuristics, it sounds like they explain a lot about why we make the choices we do. But then it also makes you wonder, if our brains are kind of wired for these mental shortcuts, can we ever really be sure we're making decisions that are truly rational?
Such a good question.
Yeah.
And it gets right to the heart of why it's so important to understand these biases.
Yeah,
It's not about getting rid of them altogether.
right.
That's probably impossible,
Yeah, they're kind of built in, it seems like.
right? It's more about recognizing their influence,
Hmm.
so that we can make more conscious, deliberate choices.
So learning to spot those moments when our intuition might be leading us down the wrong path.
Yes.
But how do we actually do that in the heat of the moment when we're like bombarded with information and need to make a decision?
It's about learning to tune in to those subtle cues, those gut feelings,
Okay.
and realizing they might be influenced by things we're not even aware of.
So we need to run those gut feelings through a quick common sense check before we just go with them.
Exactly. Now, speaking of those times when our intuition might be a little off, let's talk about loss aversion.
Loss aversion. Okay, that sounds pretty self-explanatory, but I have a feeling it's more than just like not liking to lose.
You're right, there's a lot more to it. Loss aversion means that losses, they just loom larger in our minds than gains do. Think about it this way.
Okay.
Losing, say, $100, it just feels way more painful than finding $100 feels good, right?
Oh, for sure.
Even though, objectively, it's the same amount of money.
Totally. It's like the sting of a loss. It just sticks with you so much longer than the joy of a win.
Exactly. And this built-in aversion to loss, it has a huge impact on the decisions we make. Like, we're often way more motivated to avoid a loss than we are to get an equivalent gain.
So it's almost like we're playing not to lose rather than playing to win.
Yes. In a
Yep.
lot of cases, that's a great way to put it. And this ties into another really interesting concept that Kahneman talks about, the endowment effect. This is the tendency we all have to overvalue things simply because we own them.
Oh, like when I'm convinced that my old beat-up coffee mug from college is like this priceless family heirloom,
Exactly.
even though it's probably worth about 50 cents.
Exactly. And it's not just sentimental items either.
Oh, really?
Studies have shown that people will pay way more to keep something they already have than they would pay to buy that exact same thing if they didn't already own it.
It's like once we feel that sense of ownership, it's almost like the object becomes a part of us or something.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this goes back to loss aversion. Letting go of something we own feels like a loss. And as we were just saying, losses, they just hit us harder than gains do.
So we've got loss aversion and this endowment effect, both stemming from these fascinating quirks in how our brains are wired.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Are there any other mental traps we should be on the lookout for?
Oh, definitely. Kahneman also gets into the huge influence of something called framing effects.
Okay, framing effects. What are those?
This is the idea that just the way information is presented to us, whether it's framed in terms of potential gains or losses, positive or negative, it can totally change our choices.
So even if the options themselves are objectively the same,
Right.
the way they're presented can make all the difference.
Exactly.
Wow.
One of the best examples of this is the Asian disease problem. Imagine there's this outbreak of a new disease,
Yeah.
and it's predicted to kill 600 people.
Okay, that's scary.
Right. So your job is to choose between two programs to fight the disease. Program A, 200 people will be saved. Program B, there's a 13 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 23 chance that no one will be saved.
Okay, so in that scenario, Program A seems like the safer bet.
Right.
At least 200 lives are guaranteed.
Right. That's how most people react when it's framed that way.
Huh.
But now, imagine the same exact scenario, just presented a bit differently. Program C, 400 people will die. Program D, there's a 13 probability that no one will die and a 23 probability that 600 people will die.
Oh, wow. So it's the same options, really.
It's the exact same probability.
Now Program D suddenly seems a lot more appealing.
Exactly. When the choices are framed in terms of potential losses, lives lost, people tend to become much more okay with risk.
Yeah.
They're willing to gamble on that chance that no one will die, even though the odds aren't in their favor.
That's wild. It's the same problem, just framed in a different way, and our preferences totally flip. It makes you realize just how much our decisions are swayed by things that seem small, like the wording of a question or how the information is presented.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to be aware of those subtle cues, to recognize that just the way we're presented with choices can have this huge impact on our decisions.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm finally getting a glimpse behind the scenes of my own mind, understanding why I make some of the choices I do, even the ones that aren't always like perfectly rational.
And that's precisely why I think Kahneman's work is so impactful. It's not about trying to get rid of these inherent biases.
Right.
That's probably a lost cause. It's about bringing them to light,
Yeah.
becoming aware of them so we can start to make more conscious choices.
Okay, so how can we take all of this and actually apply it to our everyday lives?
Good question.
Like, what are some practical things we can do to, as we talked about earlier, kind of tame our intuition and make better decisions?
One of the best things you can do is to just cultivate an awareness of these biases, Just remind yourself that they're always at play, even when you're not aware of them.
So it's about being a more mindful decision maker.
Yeah, like really taking a moment to pause and think about what might be shaping your choices.
Okay, I like that. So besides that, are there any other strategies that can help?
Sure. For example, when you're facing a tough decision, try to think about the problem in a few different ways. How does your perspective change when you focus on what you might lose versus what you might gain?
That's a really good point. It's easy to get stuck in just one way of looking at things.
It is. Another really useful strategy is to try to step outside of your own head for a minute and get what Kahneman calls the outside view. Instead of just going with your own personal experiences and assumptions, look at the big picture.
Okay.
What are the base rates? What's happened in similar situations?
So do your research, get some perspective.
Right. And lastly, don't be afraid to question those gut instincts, those snap judgments, especially when it's a big decision. Because those are the moments when we're most likely to be led astray by System 1.
This whole deep dive has been so helpful. If you're interested in learning more about all of this, I highly recommend checking out Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It is full of fascinating insights.
It really is a book that will change how you think about thinking.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought-provoking question. Kahneman says that we're all made up of two selves, an experiencing self that lives in the present moment, and a remembering self that reflects on our past and makes decisions for our future. Which one is the real you?
That's a great question.
And, more importantly, which one should we prioritize when making decisions? That's something to think about.
Definitely.
Until next time, keep diving deep. It's about, really tuning into those gut feelings, those kind of instant reactions we have.
Right.
And realizing, hey, those reactions, they might be based on stuff we're not even aware of.
Exactly. And, speaking of those times when our intuition might be leading us astray, have you ever heard of loss aversion?
Loss aversion. Okay, yeah. I mean, it kind of sounds like what it is, right? Like not wanting to lose things.
Yeah, but it's actually way more interesting than that. It's like losses, they just hit us harder emotionally than gains do, even when it's the same amount.
Okay, what do you mean?
So think about it losing, say, $100. It just hurts way more than finding $100 would feel good.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Right. Even though like, objectively, it's the same amount of money, it just feels different.
Totally. It's like the pain of a loss just sticks with you so much longer.
Exactly. And this whole idea, this loss aversion, it really impacts the decisions we make. We're often more motivated to avoid a loss than we are to, like, go after a gain, even if they're equal in size.
So it's like we're playing not to lose instead of playing to win.
Yes,
Yeah.
many times that's exactly it. And this connects to another cool thing. Kahneman talks about the endowment effect.
The endowment effect, what's that?
It's this weird thing where we tend to put a higher value on stuff we own simply because we own it.
Oh, like my old beat up coffee mug, the one I've had since college. I swear it's like priceless.
Exactly. And it's not just sentimental value.
Yeah.
Studies show people will pay more to hold on to something they already have than they'd pay to buy that same thing if they didn't own it.
Wow. It's like once it's ours, it's like it becomes part of us or something.
Right. And this all circles back to loss aversion. Letting go of something we own feels like a loss. And as we were just talking about, losses, they just pack a bigger punch.
Fascinating. So we've got loss aversion, the endowment effect, all these little quirks in our brains. What else should we be aware of?
Oh, there's more. Kahneman also dives into this thing called framing effects. It's this idea that the way information is presented to us can totally change our choices.
Wait, so you mean even if the options are the same?
Yep, even if the choices themselves are objectively the same. Just the way it's presented, the framing, can make all the difference. Oh yeah, it's pretty wild. The Asian disease problem is a classic example.
Okay, what's that? I've never heard of it.
Okay, imagine there's like this new disease, and it's projected to kill, say, 600 people. Scary, right?
Yeah.
And your job is to pick between two programs to fight this disease. Program A, 200 people will be saved, for
Okay.
sure. Program B, there's a 1/3 probability 600 people will be saved, but a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved.
Okay, so with program A, it's like at least 200 lives are guaranteed. That feels like the safer bet.
That's what most people think. But now imagine the same scenario with slightly different wording. Program C, 400 people will die. Program D, there's a 1/3 chance no one dies, 2/3 chance 600 people die. Same probabilities.
It's the same choices, just worded differently, but now that second option, program D, it seems more appealing.
Exactly. When it's framed in terms of potential losses,
Mm.
lives lost in this case, it makes people more willing to take a risk.
Wow, that's crazy. So it's the same problem, just a different frame, and it totally changes what people choose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just shows how much our decisions are affected by things that seem kind of small, like the wording, how it's presented. It's pretty amazing.
This whole conversation has been amazing. I feel like we're really getting a behind-the-scenes look at how our minds work. It explains so much, like why we don't always act in ways that seem perfectly rational.
I know, it's fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what makes Kahneman's work so powerful. It's not about pretending we can get rid of our biases.
Right.
It's more about understanding them, being aware of them, so we can make smarter choices.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, any final thoughts, any parting advice for our listeners on how to put all this amazing info into practice?
Well, one of the biggest things is just remembering these biases exist.
Huh?
Just keep that in mind,
Yeah.
Even when you're not really thinking about them,
Yeah.
they're still influencing you.
So be more mindful, really think things through. Don't just go with your gut all the time.
Exactly. And if you're facing a tough choice, try looking at it a few different ways. Like, what if you focused on what you stand to gain versus what you might lose? How does that shift your perspective?
That's such a useful tip. It's like taking a step back, getting a fresh angle.
Yes. And don't be afraid to do a little research. What's happened in similar situations? What are the actual odds, the statistics? It's about getting that outside view.
Don't just rely on your intuition. Check the facts, too.
Exactly. This has been a really fun deep dive. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and not really think about how our minds work.
Yeah.
But understanding these biases, these mental shortcuts, it's like having a superpower.
It really is. If you're interested in going deeper on this, I highly recommend Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's full of even more mind-blowing insights.
Oh, for sure. It's a book that will stay with you.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. Kahneman says that we're all made up of two selves: an experiencing self, living in the present moment, and a remembering self, the one that reflects on our past and makes choices for the future. Which one is the real you? And maybe even more importantly, which one should be in charge when making those big decisions? Something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.